Good morning, everyone. You probably expected a politician to be here instead of me, because I think that's what it was originally announced. I'm afraid you have to put up with me this morning. I'm not a politician, I'm a scientist, and you might have argued that there is a link between the current state of political affairs and antimicrobial resistance. Everything is a bit doom and gloom, but that's probably the only thing that links the two together. So I'm Christoph Walti. I work at the University of Leeds, and I was asked to talk about AMR. And you probably will again be surprised that I'm not a clinical scientist. I'm a physical scientist by training. And I will come back to that, to the reason why I'm standing here today and why I'm talking about AMR to you today. And just to give you a very brief introduction to that, AMR is a very complex problem, and the government and the scientific community, they have started to realize, some years ago, that if we want to successfully tackle this problem and find solutions, we as scientists across the entire scientific spectrum have to work together. And that's why not just clinical scientists or life scientists or pure life scientists are working on problems like this, but also many, many scientists from the physical spectrum are engaged in this research. So my background and my speciality is rapid diagnostics, and that's why I posed the question here: can rapid diagnostics make the required difference to solve the problem of antimicrobial resistance? When we talk to the public, we very often, instead of using antimicrobial resistance as the phrase to use, we refer to it as drug-resistant infections. And I guess it's a much more easy term to digest and is a bit more meaningful to the general public and probably even to the trained healthcare professionals. And I assume that the majority of you are, in fact, from the healthcare profession. So what I want to do today is just give a sort of an overview of what the problem actually is and how big the problem is and how bad the problem really is. And I'm not sure I have anything positive to say, so apologies in advance for that, but it's something that worries me and worries the community quite considerably. You will be aware that it's not quite 100 years ago that Alexander Fleming, predominantly by accident, discovered penicillin. And he discovered that penicillin has the capabilities of killing bacteria. And this was an important discovery. And I think as human beings, we have to be really grateful that he realized how big a deal this was. And it took only 12 years from the discovery of that fact that it can kill bacteria until we had the first antibiotic available. 12 years to come up with a wonder drug that eventually changed our lives, that changed how healthcare provision made a big, massive impact. And when I talk about antimicrobials, it's not just antibiotics, it can be drugs against bacteria, drugs against viruses, drug against fungi. Any of these would be generally classed as antimicrobials. I'm going to talk about predominantly antibiotics, and in that case, resistance is to antibiotics drugs. So these drugs, what they do is they kill or stop the growth of the organisms that cause the infection, and that's why they are so effective, and that's why they are so good. The fairy tale then continued very rapidly. Many other drugs were discovered and brought to market and brought to the clinic for daily use for everyone whenever they had a problem. And we all know that today we heavily rely on antibiotics. We heavily rely on this to treat infections that we might have for whatever reason. Maybe you have a wound that gets infected that we can easily treat, no problem, or we at least assume that we can easily treat, and we will be fine. But also when we have minor surgeries, we go to hospital, have a hip replacement. My mother had 2 hip replacements, and she went to hospital thinking it's no big deal, You get given antibiotics, you might catch an infection, but it's not going to be a problem. You will be fine, you will come out. And that is probably true, but that might well change. in the future. And I think that is where the big problem is, and I think that's why we have to be so worried. And there are a number of reasons why we have to be so worried. And I think it's not just one thing that caused the problem that we are in today, but it's a number of things that came at the same time, or more or less at the same time, that work together or generate the problem as one big thing. And so just to give you a few of those points, one of them is that the global consumption of antibiotics has increased very, very considerably in the last 10 years. So it went up by around about 40%. That's not in this country. And in many developed countries, the use of antibiotics has in fact decreased over this time period. But overall and globally, it has increased by 40%, and that is a lot. By itself, that might not have been a problem. 20, 30 years ago, that might not have been a problem, because the assumption is always, oh, we can make a new drug. We find a new one, we develop it, it will be ready when the old one is not effective anymore. However, the pace of discovery of new drugs has considerably decreased over the last decades. We are not in a position where we have, in the pharmaceutical industry, where we have a range of new potential drugs that are available, that we know some of them will make it through and will be with us soon. That is not the case anymore, I'm afraid, and that's one of the big problems that we have. And maybe another issue that very often gets forgotten is that the antibiotics used in the agricultural industry. And this is not 10%, and it's not 20%. It's a very, very significant proportion of the overall use of antibiotics, and not necessarily, and in most cases not for therapeutic reasons, but just for growth, promotion, etc. There's a huge amount that is used and that enters our food stream by that route, and that is a massive problem. It wouldn't be a problem if the organisms weren't living things that can evolve and adapt. And as we all know, living things, they are very good at that. If they have got the time to do it, they can easily cope with the new circumstances through evolution. And that's why when organisms develop a defense mechanism against the drugs that we are using to defeat them, then we have a problem, and then the drug that we are using becomes basically ineffective. This is not just true for antibiotics, it's true for any antimicrobial. That can be the case, but the most prominent of these resistances are against antibiotics, and that's the kind of thing that people keep on talking about, and that's what sometimes it's referred as ABR rather than AMR. I think one thing that we need to remember is that resistances against drugs, or in this particular against antimicrobials or antibiotics, is nothing new. This has been around for millions of years. Bacteria have evolved to be resistant against their enemies, but the timescales of that happening was very long. And there is usually sort of an understanding that if you have to mutate your genetic information to become resistant, that takes a while, and we probably have time to adapt. However, we have a much bigger problem today, and that's a mechanism of generating drug resistances that is not necessarily related or restricted to a slow process of the evolvement of their genes. One of the really big problems is the misuse and the overuse of antibiotics, and that's why we are in the problem where we are today. And if this was an isolated problem, if this was only here or somewhere else in Europe or in America or wherever, or in China, that might not be such a big deal. Of course, it would be very bad for the people who are affected in the environment here, but it's the big problem is that it's a global thing. And it's the globalization that is one of these other drivers that really made the problem to this massive problem that we have today. Globalization has had a bit of a bad press recently for all kinds of reasons, and I do agree that globalization in the context of antimicrobial or drug-resistant infections is actually quite a bad thing. You will have heard all the things that I'm telling you at some point or another, because they're not new. They have been around for a number of years. Press releases across the spectrum have appeared, and you probably will have seen it. But for completeness, I think I need to sort of relate to some of these. So in 2008, a patient that was of Indian origin, was in New Delhi, came back to Sweden, was admitted to hospital, and after a while what they have found, he was in hospital in India and in New Delhi, and after a while what they found in Sweden is that he had an infection caused by a bacteria which was resistant to multiple, not just one, multiple antibiotics, including carbapenems, which was really a bad thing, and that was really something that worried the community quite significantly. Carbapenem is one of those antibiotics that are used very often and are very useful. And if resistances are developed against these organisms, then we know we have a problem. The resistance was the bacteria became resistant because it managed to come up with an enzyme itself that could degrade the drug. And it could not degrade one drug, it could degrade the whole spectrum of drugs. This this metallo-beta-lactamase is nowadays referred to as the New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase, and the term you will have used is NDM1. Has been in the press all over. That's one of these big problematic things. I put a map up on your right-hand side here, and I hope you can see. It's a map of the world. There are symbols, round ones and triangular ones, and the triangular ones, they are places where by 2013, 5 years after the resistance was first seen, it was around for a bit longer. There were subsequent studies which showed that it has been around for a bit longer, but 5 years after it has been first discovered, the triangular points on the world map show where the infection, a drug-resistant infection, has occurred, and where the person that carried the drug-resistant infection had links to New Delhi or the wider area of India. So you might argue that's okay because they have obviously been there and they have brought the infection back. I think more worrying are the round points here. And these are infections that were found where the patient who carried them had no connection to India whatsoever. And that is really the problem, that in fact that the resistance can be transferred if you don't go back to the origin. And I think that's where we have to be worried about. Just to underline this, a study was carried out in the Netherlands on 122 travelers. They checked them for the bacteria in their gut. 10% of them, or less than 10% of them, had a drug-resistant bacteria in their system. When they came back after traveling, over 55% of them had some. There were carriers of bacteria with a particular resistance. So the globalization really helps the spread of resistances very rapidly, and if that wasn't the case, then maybe we would be in a much better place, but I'm afraid we are not. Traveling is something that we do every day. And just to add to the doom and gloom, in 2015, Tim Walsh from Cardiff University, they found a new resistance gene against one of the reserve antibiotics. And by 2016, they had evidence that resistance has already spread from China to Malaysia and Laos. And given that the mechanism of the resistance transfer is the same as MDM1, we can assume that it will soon appear here as well at quite a significant extent. So globalization is one thing that really helps spreading the problem, but there is another problem that we need to think about, and the pharma industry have been given a very bad press for this in recent years, And that's pollution created by the manufacturing of these drugs. Somewhere of the order of 80%, maybe 75 to 80% of the world's supply of antimicrobials is coming out of India and China. By a German university, the University of Leipzig, they have shown very significant problems with that as well. And the only thing I want you to focus on is on the top line, where there's a bold number where it does say 236,950. There was a stream, a small river, that flowed in the vicinity of a drug manufacturing plant, and where they have taken samples. And the water should be clean. The water is used. That water is used for agricultural use, so it is used to water plants, water fields. We'll get the water will eventually end up in the food stream. And what they have found is the numbers up there are in micrograms per liter of the thing that was tested. So that is 236 milligrams per liter of the antibiotic that was manufactured in that plant. And the reason why this is so worrying is because you probably will notice that the therapeutic range of that particular drug, the daily dose that patients are given, is somewhere between 2 to 4 times whatever is in that 1 liter that they tested. And you have to remember, it's not just 1 liter that is in that water stream, it's millions of liters. So the amount of antimicrobial just in wastewater is enormous. And obviously that gets into our system, that gets into our food chain. That has a massive impact on generating resistances. A further thing is that, which is related to the fact that we use too many antibiotics on a daily basis. And just to give you, so this statement comes out of a report by Jim O'Neill that was commissioned by the government. I will come back to that in a minute. And I'll just give you here an example because I don't have the numbers for the UK, but I don't think they're going to be very different. So in the USA, they carried out a study and they looked at patients that have a respiratory problem, which accounts overall for 40% of antibiotic prescriptions. 160 million visits in 1 year, 86 million patients did not benefit from antibiotics. That's what they knew after they carried out the study, because they had some conditions which would just not benefit from antibiotics, for example, bronchitis or asthma. The problem is, out of this 86 million, 27 million patients still received antibiotics for whatever reason, either because they demanded it when they went to the GP, which is very often the case here. If you speak to GPs, they keep on telling us these horror stories that patients come in, they demand that they want antibiotics, or for whatever other reason. But 27 million out of the 86 that would clearly not benefit were still given antibiotics. So we bring in antibiotics into our system through continuous overuse, and that is very problematic. So, sorry? 1 minute. Oh, I have to hurry up. So the big problem is that if we were able to come up with, so we have obviously a fundamental supply and demand problem, and which we need to solve. So that's where my research comes in, and that's what I'm personally working on. And because resistances against antimicrobials, resistances are very often through overuse or misuse of antibiotics. So about 5 years ago, our research councils, which have been criticized heavily for not funding research across the entire scientific spectrum, have all come together to recognize, because they recognize that we have a problem and we need scientists from across the community to tackle this problem. And that's how I came into this game. And my team are developing rapid diagnostics, so that rapid diagnostics that when we go to the GP or when we go to the hospital, that a test can be carried out here and there to tell you, would you benefit from antibiotics or not? That's what we do. I just have a schematic of what this is in a sort of on a schematic level. on the right-hand side, for everyone who doesn't sort of know, and I guess probably no one here, but for anyone who doesn't know what the diagnostics is, a pregnancy sensor, which is a diagnostic tool, that's what we develop. What we develop is really something where we can look at a number of proteins in your blood system, which will tell us what infection you have, how can it be treated, or will tell the GP or the healthcare professional how can it be treated. And that's what we do, and that's how we, as scientists, as the University of Leeds, funded by our research councils, who have very generously come up with, just for diagnostics, with a 10 million fund to do this. Overall, to tackle antimicrobial resistance, the government has spent 50 million over the last 3 years, and hopefully that's what will make a big difference. So I'm not going to talk about this. What I would like to do is just to just show the team that stands behind what we do at the University of Leeds, because without having everyone in medicine and engineering and biological sciences involved, we would not be able to make a difference, a difference that we hope we will make.